to do with trade. The requirement by American companies to give 60 days' notice of factory closures. But it was a concern the President has threatened to allay by vetoing the trade bill.
He should not veto the bill. I mean, that's basically cutting off us blue-collar workers' throats.
They're getting the top of the gravy, and the little guy, he ain't getting nothing but the crumbs.
And it was not only the workers who condemned the prospect of presidential intervention.
And now we hear, well, Mr. President, after all this work, we got to throw in the towel. Well, this Senate isn't prepared to throw in the towel.
If vetoed, the trade bill will be taken back to Congress by the Democrats. But for some in the Republican Party, the protectionist fears of many of America's trading partners is of greater import.
We're very concerned about triggering any kind of protectionist response on part of other countries.
2 years after the Chernobyl nuclear accident, which killed 31 people, Soviet officials claimed the site was now safe.
As a result of the heroic efforts, the situation in Chernobyl has now stabilized.
But the 9-kilometer exclusion zone around Chernobyl remained sealed, though many locals were moving back into a model town 48 kilometers away.
There were some people who said they would never come back, but we were not scared.
Elsewhere, the legacy of the world's worst nuclear disaster continues. In the English county of Cumbria, 750 farms and 300,000 sheep are still affected. In Poland, the most serious labor unrest since the Solidarity Union was banned in 1981. Workers at the Lenin steel mill in Krakow went on strike in support of a 50% pay rise and the reinstatement of 2 sacked union leaders. With food prices up 40% as part of economic reforms, the government tried to be philosophical.
I think that we have to expect a lot of new conflicts, a lot of, trouble in the visible future, because you have to pay a price.
He committed the most heinous acts with his very own hands, killing tens of thousands of victims with unspeakable brutality.
Retired American car mechanic John Demaniuk, convicted as Ivan the Terrible, was sentenced to death by an Israeli court. Survivors from the Treblinka death camp were ecstatic. The only other person to receive the death penalty in Israel was Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann, hanged in 1962. In South Korean parliamentary elections, defeat for President Roh Tae-woo. The government lost its majority in the National Assembly for the first time, winning only 38% of the vote. Opposition leader Kim Dae-jung took 24% of the seats, followed by the more moderate Kim Yong-sam with 19%. While students continued their anti-government protests in the streets, the opposition was preparing to exercise power in Parliament. North and West Africa, wearied by war and devastated by drought, this week was plagued by locusts. United Nations officials said the locusts could destroy up to 30% of food crops in the region. Despite efforts to stop the invasion, 70,000 square kilometers of North Africa have been left barren by the plague. On the Hawaiian island of Maui, a miracle landing, and a Lower Airlines 737 carrying 95 people managed an emergency landing despite a 6-meter hole in the plane.
Well, I heard the and I looked up towards the front, and it was all gone. And just paper and fiberglass and crap flying back in your face.
Amazingly, the only victim was a flight attendant who was sucked from the jet. Later, survivors congratulated pilot Robert Schornsteimer for landing a plane apparently crippled by old age.
In 1988, voters are looking for stability as a major quality. People who are going to do things right and are not going to take chances. Michael Dukakis and George Bush both represent stability.
And it seemed they would also represent their parties as U.S. presidential nominees in November's election. Both had resounding wins in the Pennsylvania primary, Mr. Bush for the Republicans and Governor Dukakis for the Democrats.
We're going to take back the presidency for the Democratic Party and for the country in November. You know that, and I know that. It's been tough for me, being vice president for 7.5 years. It's difficult to keep one's own charisma in check. And
Next, the collapse of a kingdom and the canning of fluorocarbons when we review the week at home after this break.
If the last 20 seconds or so didn't cause you to short circuit, you know how it feels to be a client of ours. Ernst & Winnie, accountants, advisors, consultants.
Sitting behind the wheel of a new Ford Fairmont Gear is a rather uplifting experience. With its dynamic 3.9-litre multi-point fuel-injected engine and superb range of luxury features. So, if you've set your sights on the top, there's really no question how to go. In new Ford Fairmont Gear, drive one, and you'll get there.
I've always thought one of the best things you can have is good style, and Siebel's got it. For comfort and appearance, Siebel lounge furniture competes with anything you can bring in from overseas. I love leather, and Siebel has lots of it. Great fabrics too, a cosy fit in any corner. You'll find Siebel lounges surprisingly good value. When your guests unexpectedly stay over, Siebel comes to the rescue every time. And you can only buy Siebel at a Siebel store.
Prime Computer may be big, but we're not about to get fat. We keep developing more powerful machines that expand with your organization. We understand different languages, so we talk to other computers. We have the flexibility to handle different operating systems, like Unix, and we run more software solutions than anyone else. Prime also have the largest research and development of any computer company in Australia. But that's another story.
Noise, the album, available now.
Chevy Chase and Dan Aykroyd, two of Hollywood's funniest stars, team up for the first time on television. Spies like us, sent on an impossible mission.
This is my sister. You can all have her.
But first came the special training.
You want a coffee? That's a good idea.
Then it was off to face the real world.
We're Americans!
Straight into enemy hands. They're the most outrageous double agents ever to hit the screen. Chevy Chase and Dan Aykroyd in Spies Like Us. Tonight, 8:30 on 9.
Last year, he was Australia's richest man. His personal wealth computed at well over $1 billion. This week, Robert Holmes à Court was left with a mere 100 million or so. For the czar of takeovers was himself taken over. The bell tolled for the corporate king during last October's stock market crash, which he had so airily dismissed.
I'm saying that we went into the crash with a tremendous amount of cash.
And an even bigger debt. Following the crash, Holmes à Court was forced to sell well over $4 billion worth of investments. That included the former billionaire's prized asset. Most of his stake in BHP was bought back by the big Australian last February, a move that still left Holmes à Court confident.
We've changed direction, and this company, as a result, becomes ready to pursue new objectives and go forward from there.
But for the man who once hounded the likes of BHP, the Fairfaxes, the Elliots, and US oil giant Texaco, last month came the telling irony. He himself was targeted by corporate raider Sir Ron Brierley and Kerry Packer. The short-term victors were Bond Corporation, which bought 19.9% of Bell Group, and the Western Australian State Government Insurance Commission. also grabbing 19.9%.
We feel we get a very sound investment in West Australian interests, and we feel that it has a long-term benefit to us, and we feel our involvement also gives a long-term benefit to the state.
An Australian first for Tasmania, with a ban on aerosol cans containing chlorofluorocarbons, chemicals that are eating away the ozone layer. The legislation also outlaws the sale of foam products containing CFCs and the dumping of air conditioners and refrigerators without first removing the chemicals.
Tough legislation with very heavy fines, because as a government we're serious about doing something in protecting that opening of the ozone layer hole.
Tasmania's concern, it's the closest Australian state to Antarctica, where the ozone layer has been most damaged.
They are leaderless, principleless, policyless.
The Prime Minister's delight was obvious. It took 7 meetings this week for the coalition finally to decide on a television audience limit, an increase to 100% in return for more metropolitan stations and a speedy introduction of pay television.
This is the most deregulatory, pro-competitive media policy that has been adopted by either side of politics in Australia.
But the other side of politics rejected the proposal. That left the limit at 60% and the 10 and 7 networks over the limit.
I've certainly been surprised that in something such as significant to this country, the media industry, that the opposition did not have a coherent policy.
The week brought the most significant change to Australia's industrial laws in 84 years. A new industrial relations bill will halve the number of federal unions by raising to 3,000 the minimum membership requirement.
I think it should reduce demarcation disputes, make it easier for employers to reach agreements with unions if there are less of them.
Under the new legislation, the 80-year-old Conciliation and Arbitration Commission will be replaced by an Industrial Relations Commission.
Everybody knows that Russian ships, fishing ships, have 2 purposes. One is to pull fish out of the sea, and the other is to engage in surveillance.
Opposition concerns over proposals to allow a fleet of Soviet fishing vessels to be based in Australian waters, most of them in the West.
I think it'd be a fairly inefficient way to put spies into operation if they were transshipping. One thing we've got to watch is to make sure that what are designated as commercial vessels are commercial vessels.
The value for Australia, say the Russians, would be about $200,000 a year for each ship. A guilty verdict for bankrupt Sydney doctor Jeffrey Edelston. The medical tribunal upheld 6 charges of professional misconduct and found him to be, quote, not of good character. It was proven that Edelston had improper dealings with hitman Christopher Flannery, had encouraged doctors working for him to overservice, and had engaged in improper fee sharing. His penalty is to be announced next Friday. And it was the week thousands turned out to honour Australia's war veterans. The dwindling number of Anzacs boosted by their Vietnam counterparts.
You can't define that bond of friendship and comradeship that exists. A lot of people have tried to, but they can't.
In France, too, there was recognition of Australian forces, in particular their defence of the small village of Villiers-Bretonneux. 4 veterans, all in their 90s, received the Legion of Honour from France's Defence Minister on behalf of all Australian soldiers. And of course, it's been a turbulent week in New Caledonia, with more deaths as settlers squared up to Kanaks. The Kanaks released some of their hostages, only to take more, including the head of the French anti-terrorist squad. At this stage, 23 are still being held. The French government has threatened to outlaw the independence movement. From Noumea, John Gatfield reports the Kanaks are showing no signs of releasing their captives.
We are obliged to keep this hostage. Maybe 2 days or 1 week, I don't know, we don't know. Now the responsibility is with Mr. Chirac, with his government.
The placid tropical islands of New Caledonia were torn apart as the Kanak liberation movement used last Sunday's presidential and local elections as a platform for violent protest. Most dramatic was the continuing siege on Uvea, where French gendarmes were held captive in a coral cave by 15 Kanaks, threatening to execute them. Additional embarrassment came when the chief of France's anti-terrorist unit, Captain Philippe Legaujoux, was then taken prisoner himself, along with members of his squad. But by week's end, France was suggesting this was a deliberate ploy to gain access to the cave. Certainly, Captain Legaujoux was released to act as a negotiator. On the nearby island of Lifu, French forces faced flaming roadblocks, masked Kanaks openly defying the military despite the weaponry arrayed against them. Loyalists of white and mixed blood had their own blockade, stopping anyone but the army and police from getting through to the Kanaks at Saint Louis. Their disgust for Australians and Australia's tacit support of the Kanaks was made obvious.
On ne veut pas de journalistes australiens. C'est clair.
In Paris, the Australian ambassador was reprimanded for Australia's stand, but Prime Minister Hawke repeated that some discussion was still desirable in New Caledonia.
But there should be a realisation on all sides of the necessity to sit down and discuss how, in fact, the people of New Caledonia are going to be able to be given the maximum opportunity of emerging to a political and constitutional situation which will enable various communities in that tragically troubled country to live in peace.
The FLNKS leadership pledged to continue their violent campaign, aiming to so disrupt the elections of last weekend and next Sunday, May the 8th, that France will be forced to negotiate independence. As it turned out, 35 polling booths in remote Kanak strongholds did stay closed last Sunday. That's from a total of 139. But those who did vote gave overwhelming support to the no independence policy of Prime Minister Jacques Chirac. 75% of the vote went his way here, with President Mitterrand's paltry 5% reflecting contempt for his desire to compromise and consider partial self-rule. The problems of New Caledonia have now become an election issue for all Frenchmen. Next Sunday, Mitterrand and Chirac contest the presidency, with clear distinctions in their policies for this part of the world. Now, more violence has been promised, with the fate of the French hostages possibly determining the outcome of this election.
That report from National 9 News correspondent John Gatfield in Amir. Next, our studio guest, the Minister for Social Security, Brian Howe, after this.
First, we brought you the Pavarotti collection. Now, another of the greatest voices of our time. Placido Domingo. The Placido Domingo collection is a magnificent limited edition double album presentation. Surely one of the most important records of the year. The Placido Domingo collection, now available in Australia on record, cassette and compact disc. In stores now from Dino Music.
When the world's top drivers clash on the world's fastest and most demanding Grand Prix street circuit. Adelaide comes alive.
Adelaide comes alive.
The Foster's Australian Formula One Grand Prix, November 10 to 13. Book now at Bass.
When you can't take any more and life becomes too difficult to bear, don't give up. Help is at hand. Reach for the phone. Call Living Hope. It's comforting to know somebody cares. Somebody is willing to listen to your troubles, however great or small. Share yours with a counsellor. Together, you can work them out. Living Hope counsellors care 24 hours a day, so don't hesitate. Give them a call. Yes, there is hope. Living Hope.
Set Tech 9. Constructors of high-quality film sets and props will turn their hands to anything you need to help sell a product. Stage a display or trade presentation. If you want, they'll build the stage too. Set Tech 9. Remember the name when you need ideas, special effects, a design team to get it all together, craftsmen to make and install the finished product. No matter how big or small the project, Set Tech 9 is equal to the occasion. Call them or call in. 22 Bennett Avenue, Edwardstown, and get set.
The first Regency Park Scout Group caters for disabled youth. It covers a large cross-section of the community, filling huge gaps within recreation through disabled scouting. Gather a group of friends, select a venue and hold a wheelathon to raise funds. Have fun and support the first Regency Park Disabled Scouts. Contact Peter Schiller on 266 1716 after 5 p.m.
On 60 Minutes, fake accidents. They're a huge insurance rip-off.
It's been estimated that's costing us close to $2 billion per year.
But the gang that tried claiming on this got caught.
They weren't in the car. There was no one in the car at all. It was a setup.
Bob Hope.
Congratulations. Hey, how are you? All right, how are you?
He's about to turn 85, and Hollywood says thanks for the memories. 60 Minutes, brought to you by Toyota tonight, 7:30 on 9.
It's now part of political law that one of the major reasons for Labor's disastrous showing at the recent polls is a public perception that it's lost touch with its traditional values. Labor, says its hardcore supporters, is the party which should be committed to improving the lot of the needy, not the party with an image of looking after the wealthy. Well, tomorrow, Prime Minister Hawke will make a major statement on social justice called Towards a Fairer Australia, a statement which will defend his government's record and lay down guidelines for the future. The man who'll have the carriage of much of the government's future social justice efforts is Brian Howe, Minister for Social Security. He's in our Melbourne studios to interview him. Sunday's political editor, Laurie Oakes. Laurie.
Thanks, Jim. Mr. Howe, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Laurie.
Whose fault is it that you have to answer claims that you're not a real Labor government?
Well, I think it's the fault of a very difficult economy. I think the government has developed a very good record for the way it's tackled the problems of the economy. But, of course, the downside of that is that we've had to practice a great deal of restraint. And I think sometimes we've perhaps presented our policies in a rather unbalanced way. We've put too much emphasis on the problems in the economy that need to be addressed. We perhaps haven't emphasised as much our achievements in social policy areas.
So you do concede that you're seen as a government for big business and the well-to-do, not a government for the workers and the underprivileged?
Well, of course, I don't concede that. I think that our employment record is one that has done a great deal to produce a fairer Australia, and it certainly compares well with any other country, socialist or conservative within Western Europe or the OECD.
Sure, we're talking about perceptions. That's not the way the government's seen, is it?
Well, I think that in terms of the electorate, we need to do more to communicate what we have done, but we also need to be just as clear about our social agenda as we have been about our economic agenda.
I wonder how you, as Social Security Minister, feel about the image of a government that looks after its rich mates, the dinner suit and Bollinger type image that the government has.
Well, I think that its image is not simply that of economic responsibility. We are, after all, the government that has put the question of child poverty on the agenda, a government that has sought to address that with probably one of the most significant reform packages in terms of family assistance in the post-war period. And furthermore, unlike the reforms of the Fraser government in that area, I believe